Hello, void and all who inhabit it, it's me. And if you would, please allow me to coin a phrase. Actually, I'm not the first person to use the term wokesploitation. However, I am striving to craft a description that I hope will be helpful for this wave of films that have been currying my personal goat for years now. I do want to note early that while there is, and these are times of reheating the nachos, an amplified intention to capitalize off of what's topical, locking into a trend is not that unique in the entertainment space. It's how we get Shakespearean retelling set in high schools, or raunchy rom-coms about quirky blonde women. But exploitation films do more than ride on coattails. Also, yes, I've talked about exploitation a few times before. I've even scratched at this idea that recent media is uncritically making a wokeness monster. But hey, I have a brain that likes patterns. Knowing about a schema that's predicated on
here's a pattern that keeps repeating for a short amount of time
really makes said brain go burr. Also, I haven't really talked about exploitation beyond addressing any pre-existing connotations you might have with the word and stating that exploitation subgenres take advantage of what's topical. Given that we are building a subgenre from scratch today, I think it's important to understand how exploitation functions as a generic label, and as such, there are 3 elements about exploitation films in general that will be helpful to ground us in building out wokesploitation. Firstly, exploitation subgenres are born from the specific focus on topics that seem difficult to approach: countercultures, aging women, teenage sexuality, the existence of niggas. As such, there's often a horror element, but more importantly, the exploitation occurs not just because a subject is topical, but also because a filmmaker is capitalizing off of a taboo conversation. Secondly, exploitation films are frequently marked as being cheap. Cheapness in terms of look and feel, but also in terms of actual budget. Catching on to a trend quickly begets cheapness. The faster you can produce a film, the faster it can be distributed, and several corners may be cut in that process. However, we are arguably now beginning to see the inverse as well, of spending a lot of money to make an enticing film as quickly as possible. Additionally, an element of filmmaking that is unfortunately becoming a bit more explicitly discussed is how much money a producer can extrude from a project. I've vocalized my frustration with the combination of fear and greed that's undermining art as we know it in previous videos, so I won't harp on that too much here, but just know finances are a multi-pronged factor lurking in the background. What is notable about cheapness in relation to profit when it comes to exploitation films is that such a focus is an element that made blaxploitation inherently different from other exploitation genres that simply looked to recreate the lightning in a bottle captured by an initial film or aimed to capitalize off of a niche set of actors. Original recipe blaxploitation was proliferated through indie filmmakers creating low-budget films out of necessity, in large part due to the heavy political messaging within their narratives. However, these films, like all other exploitation subgenres, were almost immediately labeled as cheap carbon copies in a pejorative sense, which brings us to the final element. Exploitation is traditionally not a chosen moniker, but rather a label placed by critics. Filmmakers can choose to lean into the label, usually after the peak of a wave, but exploitation is initially utilized pejoratively, often attacking whatever counterculture or taboo topic is being addressed. For example, one of the only other uses of wokesploitation that I could find was in an article from the conservative magazine The Spectator that uses wokesploitation as a dog whistle whilst complaining about the more diverse 2021 Oscar nominees. My use of wokesploitation as an identifier isn't to admonish the idea of a story explicitly challenging harmful societal systems, or, God forbid, presenting humanity as something that exists in people who aren't cishet and white. Rather, I'm concerned that how these conversations about harmful systems are being pursued leads to watered down analysis within media. My criticism isn't with the topics, but the execution. However, because I'm applying this label the way that a critic would, I need to acknowledge that 1, as always, being critical of a film isn't a death sentence. If you can believe it, I even enjoyed some of the films we'll be talking about today. And 2, my interest is in impact over intent. Art, when released into the world, takes on a life of its own, and it is okay to acknowledge, critique, and examine that. What then is wokesploitation? An unofficially official definition of wokesploitation would be narratives that focus on an awareness and or critique of a social inequity. These films often contain horror, psychological thriller, and black comedy elements. To break it down even further, there are 4 major traits that denote a film might be a wokesploitation. Firstly, the zeitgeist. It's the age of the think piece, baby. From the post-racial America ushered in by Obama to right before the cultural whitelash we're currently living in, it became trendy to platform conversational critiques about harmful systems. You simply have to read the inside flap of white fragility, discover 3 new vocabulary words to toss into the critical thought Mad Libs, and boom. Also, many political movements from the 2010s have been defanged. They're no longer seen as too radical to produce a story around. From a less cynical viewpoint, we are at a moment of a greater willingness, perhaps, to encourage critical challenging of systems, to find ways to hold people in power accountable, to, as Tumblr tried in 2014, finally check our privilege. Secondly, these films have a capital M message. It's punchy, it's simple, and it's often one of 2 things. The system is real, and it hurts. These films give very much,
"It's my 3rd day understanding that racism really is institutionalized, and this film will help hammer that scary reality home."
The second message that's often presented is f the power.
We're flinging shit at the top of the social pyramid. The little guy, who's maybe actually more of the mid-tier guy, is finally biting back.
When it comes to the protagonist leading us to this groundbreaking claim, one thing is pretty consistently true. They are isolated. Said isolation is literal and figurative. Many of these stories hinge on a protagonist being trapped at a rich person's remote something or other, but also our protagonist is one of one. They are the only bombshell of color in the villa, the only brokey in the room, the only person to pick up that something is off. Sometimes they have a friend help, but often they remain the singular outsider. Through this, we get a narrative focus on the impact and influence of the individual that occurs both through our isolated protagonist and their antagonist. Our big bads tend to function as the personification of an ism. The story may take some time to explore that the antagonist is working literally or figuratively as part of something larger, but we're primarily interested in the behaviors of a singular or small group of actors, almost to the point of separating them from the system they are a distillation of. More than questioning the reaches of the man, we're looking at the actions of your man, or your boss, or your oligarch in chief. These 4 elements could mix together in a myriad of ways, but they often are distilled into one of 3 templates. The first being Jordan Peele's Sons. Low-key, any movie with a lone black character facing institutionalized nonsense that's not explicitly perpetuated by the Klan fits in this category. God forbid a nigga rage against the machine without somebody mentioning Get Out. Admittedly, this subsect of films is kind of belabored by the same thought processes that lead audiences to labeling a film as a blaxploitation, derogatory, because there is a conscious acknowledgement of a system of harm within a story that isn't supposed to make you feel good or present poverty porn-tinted bootstrappery, but rather asks you to consider how invasive the harmful system is. The film is woke. Secondly, are films that utilize interpersonal relationships as a half-open gateway to understanding structural issues. Here we have a very clear hold on how the individual is harmed, but a much weaker grasp of the bigger picture. A lot of the films in this tier deal with gender inequality as the schema being critiqued. Many of these films harken back to the feminist satire of the 60s and 70s, wherein an ideal relationship is shattered by the reality of how pervasive and destructive patriarchy truly is. But these films can also read like the waxings of a man who's in his 2nd year of realizing sexism is real, and he has to showcase how much he understands by putting a single woman through a bunch of horrible shit. On the flip side, and in our 3rd template of films, are those that very blatantly use characters as chess pieces of the larger message. Here we watch archetypes play through the system to make clear to us that billionaire douche bros are bad, or whatever the message is. This is where Eat the Rich goes to die, and I've yapped about that before, so I won't get into it all here. However, I will add that I think this section is so highly populated by Eat the Rich films because the low-hanging fruit of shitting on the uber rich is easier to stomach than just as blatantly dunking on men or white people, unless the man in question is an incel or the white people in question are racist, TM. But even then, we've exhausted, and so quickly, the idea of the Karen or what an evil boyfriend looks like. Our racist white has to be a little bit more dynamic. Our evil boyfriend can't be twirling a mustache from the beginning. We can creep a little closer when it comes to race and gender because we are familiar with those very caricature-like positions of what racism and sexism looks like. We can maybe shake the table a little bit more, put some images that maybe feel a little bit more familiar. As the ones that we're critiquing, we're not quite ready yet to do that with class. Critiquing the suburban crime syndicate that is the HOA might not go over as well as openly mocking Elon Musk or Joe Rogan, hit dogs and whatnot. There's also a level of distancing here that is very important to maintain regardless of who's being critiqued. We as the audience have to remain distanced, feel better than whoever is presented as the antagonist in the film. Irrespective of which template we're looking at, the behavior of the antagonist and the structure of the narrative feeds directly into the strength of the message. And it's here where things start to get fuzzy. The punchy message of the wokesploitation film is appealing because it allows for a more direct critique, especially when the individual antagonist resembles somebody in power. But even when our opposing force is the layperson moonlighting as a member of the Legion of DEI Doom, the message may still feel concentrated enough to target a specific type of person in the viewer's life. However, that same narrow scope of
let's look at this individual person's individual harm
can undermine the potential spread of the message. An example that for some reason immediately came to my mind is Mickey 17 in comparison to BioShock with regards to how a narrative critiques the intent to create a utopia that intentionally relies on recreating flawed systems. If you haven't seen Mickey 17, rectify that, but the film is about the titular character taking part in an expedition to colonize a distant planet. Said expedition is led by disgraced senator and egomaniacal allegory Kenneth Marshall, who, spoiler alert, puts everyone in jeopardy because of his insatiable need to stroke his necrotic ego. This film is so focused on killing the oligarch that there's little to no time spent addressing the senator's sycophants who are on the ship and how they would react to his death and the complications that those reactions may cause. It's made very clear early in the film that there are people who join the expedition solely because they believed in Marshall's messaging, which is loaded, to put it lightly. Those followers, that mentality doesn't go away simply because the head has been cut off of the snake. In comparison, in the BioShock series, which is a game trilogy about, among other things, failed attempts at utopian cities, there is always a targeted effort to spend some time unraveling the reality that communities run on exploited labor will inevitably face rebellion. Systems work because multiple people are allowing, aiding, and abetting for shit to continue, and systems fall because collectives demand something different be done. That is a particularly important distinction to make if there is potential by the narrative to crack the veneer for the layperson watching, which I think wokesploitations can do. Blink Twice has a good understanding that things work because people work together, for good and for evil. But often the desire to defeat the monster forsakes any possibility to knock the dust off the mind of the viewer because the story deems it more important to turn Little Miss whoever the fuck into Perseus or to get off some overwrought jokes about the 1%. I know BioShock is a series of games with dozens of hours of gameplay and a myriad of world-building elements that a film would just never have. And BioShock itself is not without criticism, in large part because of what's presented in the narrative in comparison to what's done with it. In fact, BioShock is actually probably a really good place to examine the effects of a story whittling down systemic critiques to pivot its focus towards the machinations of a singular man behind the curtain. The bait and switch of these games is borderline diabolical, but my point here is to highlight how disappointing analysis is a result of how a narrative does or doesn't unravel what it presents. In the example of Mickey 17, the story set up that the senator has sycophants and then never acknowledges them or their embrace of Marshall's ideology as an obstacle. The resulting impact of the underutilized potential within any wokesploitation film is a comfortable distancing that allows a command of buzzwords and little little more. That distancing morphs what could be applicable analysis into something abstract and simply fictionalized. When this is repeated in multiple films, the impact is a further desaturation of societal analysis to the point at which societal analysis just becomes a plot device, and worse, an annoying one. We are beating the same rug with little to no deviation, and it's getting very old. We're not only exploring the same topics, but doing so with a lack of intersectionality that could easily add some well-needed depth. There's a lack of intersectionality with regards to the axes of marginalization presented within these stories, but there's also a refusal to expand the scope to consider other intersecting aspects of life that might be impacted by disruptive systems of harm. There are several recent films questioning gender inequality, but 9 times out of 8, it's within a cishet dynamic. They/them is the only recent-ish example that I could think of that I would consider a wokesploitation. However, that movie is questionable for a myriad of reasons, the most glaring of which being that it low-key places its non-binary character into a binary. Actually, could Emilia Perez fit here? I refuse to watch that film, so you'll have to let me know, but it's very much giving,
"This is topical, let's make a movie about it."
In return, the entire nation of Mexico will malign your name for the rest of eternity, as they should. Another glaring gap in wokesploitation is that several of these films use indigenous side characters, named and unnamed, within the uber-rich isolated hellscape, yet contain little to no acknowledgement of how these people, their practices, and or their land are being consumed within and by the story. It's also notable how little disability is a topic of these films. I mentioned hit dogs hollering when it comes to class analysis, but a message that requires distancing in order to be most impactful is difficult to achieve if the story widens the scope of audience members available to critique. Everybody might not be the type of milquetoast liberal to claim they'd vote for Obama a third time, but most people don't wear masks in public settings anymore. If a film like Kimmy shifted from having an agoraphobic protagonist to one who is still isolating out of COVID consciousness fueled by being immunocompromised, I don't think it would spark a wave of exploitation films around disability advocacy, because most of us are still actively participating in the creation of these conditions. It would be much more difficult to pass the harm off as a behavior of those on extreme fringes when it's something you so readily see yourself and the people around you participating in. And that's just one example. A lot of able-bodied folks don't care about disability and accessibility related issues, and they don't want to be reminded that they don't care. In fact, it's easiest to make a vaguely political statement when you keep the scope narrow, when you focus on the fringes, when you have a target that feels safely provocative to poke at. However, wokesploitation closes into a pinpoint and misses what made initial entries to the subgenre work. As the 2 films I would credit with having a major unintentional ripple effect, Get Out and Knives Out, were initially impactful because they both had a preposition in their title, and they shed light on the reality that the beneficiaries of a system will uphold said system so long as they continue to benefit from it. That doesn't disappear because you've worked for someone or befriended them or started dating them. Humanity is stripped from people in the name of upholding systems of power and harm every day in strange and mysterious and horrifying ways that we, the people, not the oligarchs, can be actively, sometimes happily, complicit in. That must be understood in order to be dismantled, questioned, challenged. But I think it's really hard to convince people to change when they don't even believe that a problem exists, let alone that they are feeding into it. To do both requires a message wrapped in characters that feel like real people, not repackaged lectures or lukewarm jabs at the worst of the worst. And when a film props up the chance to send a message over the need to understand the point of the message, you get something uniquely unsatisfying. Opus is a psychological thriller written and directed by former GQ editor Mark Anthony Green. A young writer is invited to the remote compound of a legendary pop star who mysteriously disappeared 30 years ago. Surrounded by the star's cult of sycophants and intoxicated journalists, she finds herself in the middle of his twisted plan. Fresh off of the wokesploitation assembly line, how does Opus fit into the genre? The time is the time, babe, and this is a 2025 release. Opus might be extra timely when we consider the current critiques of celebrity culture that are swimming around in the zeitgeist. I would predict that a psychological thriller based on how people interact with Miss Chicharron will be released by spring 2027 at the rate that we're currently going. We have our isolated protagonist in Ariel. Ariel is isolated at work. When her invite to the release party is delivered to her job, somebody deadass says, "Who is that?" She's later isolated physically by being stuck at a rich person's remote space for crimes. And of course, she is one of Jordan Peele's sons and has the esteemed acclaim of being the only Black person in the film. Despite my issues with Opus, I will say it does get points for being an official entry to the Kingdom of Blasia's National Film Registry. Ariel is also the only one who is questioning what's going on. She's a triple threat, you could say. Along with Ariel, we have a cast of archetypes: the aging journalist, the talk show host, the paparazzi, the influencer, the guy whose role is so minuscule he dies in his third scene. We're fitting a template here. Notably, Ariel is plunged into the story because of her relationship with Jack, the aging journalist in question, but we learn the true importance is her relationship with Michael Eaton Bowie, the pop star, fitting a whole nother template. This film has it all. It's a
chocolate vanilla swirl with cookie crunch, please.
Surely this has to work. Well, I'm happy to announce that this smorgasbord of visual and narrative motifs coalesced into a statement about celebrity worship, cults, the two-piece combo otherwise known as Scientology. It's actually not really clear, which is why Opus didn't really work. The over-reliance on familiar pieces didn't join up to say anything. To the frustration of folks on Letterboxd, some of the elements of Opus feel excruciatingly familiar because they aren't rehashed to explore anything new or much of anything at all. Letterboxd is not a bastion of critical thought, and there's perhaps an issue with media literacy wherein we are seeing an over-reliance on being able to understand one thing by comparing it to another. But everybody calling this film the menu for worried darlings who blinked twice during Midsommar launched this whole diatribe you've been listening to, so credit where credit is due. We're presented visual cues and expected to be enthralled by the presentation alone within a story that does nothing with it. It's not all too different from sequels that come out decades after the original film that over-rely on callback. But instead of nostalgia, we're overwhelmed with social commentary, TM. My theory is that Opus has a strong aroma of nothingness because Ariel was initially a white male character. Walk with me. What is this film inevitably about? What's the pearl we're shucking 90 minutes worth of oysters for? The film would have me believe that the end message is that this protagonist was so focused on making a name for themselves, they weren't cognizant of who or what they were helping. However, this entity the protagonist is helping is never really established. So although I'm told to be weary of it, I'm not sure why. Like, yeah, Michael Eaton Bowie killed some people, but what is he trying to do? And why is he trying to do it now? I kept questioning what was so important about this moment in Michael Eaton Bowie's life that he needed to invoke his plan, and I realized that the timing has nothing to do with the pop star and everything to do with Ariel, but for no reason. If you ignore the tropes and familiar strangeness, Opus more so presents as a way for someone to complain about not being rewarded for being average by setting up a reason for them to be extraordinary. But the interesting thing, more interesting than a collage of weird interactions pulled from experiences interviewing the outlandishly rich, could have been to examine the ennui born from a sense of entitlement clashing with the reality of being mediocre. Plus, because we're not traversing this conversation with a white male protagonist, there's maybe more room to chip away at the setup of a false meritocracy through the lens of someone who followed all the steps yet isn't where they want to be, and the person who knows how to exploit that disappointment in her in order to accomplish something nefarious. Which, at the end, is kind of what they want me to believe, right? But it's a hard sell, in large part because the something nefarious is never really established. This is just an elusive pop star being cunty for nebulous evil, and shockingly, that is not as fun as you would think. Regardless, unpacking the driving force of the protagonist a bit more still would have allowed for a woke challenge of social structures with a guy in power as the big bad. But what's being questioned isn't a system outright, it's the desperation that pushes people to actively buy into systems of harm in the first place. That's an exploration that feels pretty connected to how white men are moving through the world right now, very relevant, very topical, and again, could have been a bit more palatable given that this message would be explored through unconventional packaging. It's also not too much of a stretch to examine stan culture from that point, so we can still get the critique about celebrity worship shoehorned in there somehow. However, such an exploration of Ariel's motivation doesn't happen, given that the story is, I guess, focused on slightly questioning the means justifying the end, i.e. how Ariel achieves a career as a famous writer by platforming a bad guy, and never considers how the initial motivation might have also been flawed, might have also been something worth questioning, examining, unraveling. It's not weird to want to pursue a creative career, but why does Ariel feel entitled to be at a certain place at this point? Why does she never question the invitation to fictional Arizona Graceland in the first place? Why are any of the other people there either? They serve very little purpose. Ariel has very little interaction with them, and even their role as archetypal figures is unsatisfying. Ultimately, Opus is a well-acted, beautifully filmed, slack-jawed gawk at the things we let rich people get away with because they're talented or something. I think if wokesploitation wanted to be compelling and not simply provocative, we could have films that question systems and their insidious growth and our collective participation in our individual harm and the potential for something more, better, different. But we don't. Instead, we get beloved actors dressed like assassin droids, pelvic thrusting in 4K. Exploitation tends to burn bright and fast. Movies will move on because culture will move on. The next wave of war propaganda films is coming in hot, even if Alex Garland has to shepherd it in with his bare hands. But exploitation films don't exist in vacuums. They can start careers or revitalize them, lead to decades of cultural references, impact filmmakers decades removed. Given that the focus of wokesploitation has been to take a basic attempt at social commentary, shave it down, and ship it out quickly, it's worth considering the ripple effect that these films will have beyond the production of the next installment to the genre. Analysis is now annoying when it could be a puzzle piece to a bigger picture, and that's disappointing to me. As media literacy tanks and reactionary views gain traction, it's frustrating to watch the commodification of structural analysis, not just because I like art, that is interesting, but because I care about encouraging and nurturing spaces for critical thought. And maybe you're still here to tell me that it's not that deep. Maybe the intention of these films is not to present social commentary in a way that's accessible, but rather to send out a singular, punchy message, and that's enough. Maybe the jokes and the jump scares and the thinly veiled allegories are the only point. But y'all done made the same point 7 fucking times. Try some new shit. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. If you're watching early from Patreon, thank you for your support. I wanted to shoehorn a Disco Elysium reference in here somewhere, but I couldn't make it shake. So I'm instead asking you to do it and asking, have you seen any of these films? What did you think about them? Do you like any of them? Do you hate them? What's on your mind, beloved? I should not repeat myself because it makes the captions very difficult to do. What else do I have in mind? I've watched Sinners only once. Props to everybody who saw it more than 5 times. Ridiculous, girl. Get that AMC pass, mama. Anyway, I bring that up because I'm hoping Sinners inspires a wave of films about real eaters up next. Anything in exchange for all of these terrible ass takes y'all are posting on social media. I need some good cinema to come from all of these horrific discussions. That being said, I have nothing to add to the horrific discussions. If anything does come to mind, it will be posted on my Patreon, where I also share what I've watched every month. We talk about books sometimes. I occasionally have a burst of inspiration and post something new. I am thinking of doing shot analysis videos, speaking of Sinners, because of that tweet from the production designer. We'll see. Girl, you know me. I'm just vibing, chilling, imbibing, yapping. Until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.